And we are back on the 0 hour. Joining me once again is my very good friend, Harvey K. Harvey K is historian, professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay, and the author of a number of books, including Thomas Paine and The Promise of America. And it struck me that with No Kings demonstrations coming up this weekend all around the country, why not refer back to the OG, as it were, of American no kingsism? And that would be, of course, Thomas Paine. And who better to talk about that with than Harvey J. Kaye. So first of all, Harvey, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. It is always a pleasure to join you on the 0 hour. Always.
And it's always a pleasure to have you. And it's always a pleasure to contemplate the career of Thomas Paine, who, among other things, was fearless in his confrontation of hypocrisy and dishonesty and people just not wanting to know what they weren't comfortable knowing. I believe it was John Paine who said, I believe the quote was, when knowledge is a duty, ignorance is a crime. Is that, have I quoted him correctly?
I don't know. I don't know that quote in particular, but it definitely sounds like Paine. Um, I will tell you that it's just so everyone knows, because we don't need to go through everything about him. But, for 200 years after the revolution, the elites, the pompous and the pious and the privileged and the powerful, all those kinds of folks, they did everything in their power to suppress Thomas Paine's memory. And where they couldn't exactly suppress it, they did everything to besmirch it. I mean, they told true. Donald Trump may not even have been as clever as they are in the lies that these people have told about Thomas Paine. And we know how really outrageous and disgusting Trump is capable of being. But anyhow, what happened is that in every generation, practically in every decade, whatever the progressive cause was, liberal, radical, socialist, you can go through the entire array of progressive struggles, including abolition and free thought and feminism. Over and over again, they all discovered Thomas Paine by way of common sense and rights of man, and indeed, especially on the left, agrarian justice, his final major pamphlet in which he's basically calling for what we today would refer to as social security. And that's in the 1790s. So, I mean, Paine in many ways, somebody used to say, the forgotten founding father. He was never forgotten, but he's never truly been admitted into the core of the founders, the likes of Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and so on. But nevertheless, as they say, it's not just no pain, no gain.
Right,
Right.
right, right. The
But
the reason why I quoted that quote, there are a number of others sort of half buried in my mind. In particular, though, I love that you just explained that, Harvey, because to me, uh, really fostering a revolution or fostering the idea that no human was born to rule another human, which should be the
right.
theme of No Kings, and
Yeah.
aggressive assertions of human rights and those sorts of things. Uh, I think there was another quote where he said, if you're not willing to outrage, you're not willing to tell the truth, or something like that. It's that for too long, I feel that the political discourse in this country, certainly on the left, broadly speaking, has been overly civil. And by that, I mean not punching people or insulting people, but afraid to challenge the assumptions on which the status quo is built. And since we set this conversation in terms of the
Yeah.
No Kings demonstrations, I just want to focus in on that for a second and get your thoughts, because it seems to me that the No Kings demonstrations can be great if they are not just a rejection of Donald Trump, as the quote unquote resistance
Right.
turned out to be in the first term. If they are, because Paine wasn't just rejecting King
Right.
George,
Right.
he was aggressively speaking out for fundamental rights and imagining those rights as they might exist in the real world. And to me, if No Kings becomes Orange Man bad, as they say,
Yeah. Right.
it's going to be a lost opportunity because no kings to me means billionaire donors, no billionaire donors, no any of it. And I was just
Yeah.
curious to get your
Yeah, that's it.
perspective
Yeah,
on that.
as I tell it in my book, Thomas Paine, The Promise of America. Yeah, I mean, his primary target in the course of writing Common Sense, primary target in the course of writing Common Sense is monarchy. Okay, monarchy. And the reason he did so, the reason he made that so central to it is that during the time of the revolution, let's start with the rebellion in the 1760s into the 1770s. Over and over again, the target of American anger was Parliament, because
Mhm.
Parliament is the ones that pass the laws, the taxes, the controls over shipping, the all the regulations that led Americans to protest not simply no taxation without representation, but no legislation without representation. So, and in their minds, and as I think it was Paine who realized that Americans lived so far from London that they could easily too readily idealize the king
Mm.
above, if you like, Parliament. That this isn't the fault of the king. This is the fault of Parliament. Which, by the way, I can't help but go into my history here. That was also the case in the Peasants' Rising of 1381, when they rose up against lords, basically the aristocrats, the landlords, the nobles who were ruling them and exploiting them, and keeping them from having decent access to everything that comes out of the land. But they appealed to the idea of the king. And in fact, when they said there should be no aristocrats, no lords, they allowed for one, which would have been the king, because their assumption was the king was a decent fellow. Anyhow,
And if I remember my history correctly, number one, I was actually going to bring that up. I'm glad you brought that up. Number one, they even used the king as kind of a symbol. As I recall, this parliament, these aristocrats are ill serving our noble king, that sort of thing. And I think there was even a point in that rebellion when they had hoped the king might give them his blessing.
yes, absolutely.
It
Which may
all
well be
be
why they probably wanted to go down to London, not to take over London necessarily, but to get the king's blessing, so to speak.
yeah, but they burned a lot of big houses while they were
Oh
there.
yes, oh yeah, no, no, these were not pacifists.
Right.
But
Uh, the
I would just add to that, if I could,
Sure,
that
please.
because I don't want, especially because my wife is originally British, I want to make it clear the English did eventually teach the French how to take off the head of a king in the 17th century. Okay.
But then they put his kid back in or
Yeah,
whatever. Never.
well,
Yeah, and
right.
and of course Oliver Cromwell, whatever his virtues, but we're getting digressing here,
Yes.
is not fondly remembered by the Irish for pretty
No,
good
God, no,
reason.
absolutely not.
Uh, so history is a series of progressions and fallbacks and
Right.
progressions more, which is part of the reason we're here. So this, first of all, I think from a communications perspective, no kings is powerful as a
Oh, but
slogan.
yes, I was going to say you're definitely all along I've thought no. In fact, my original response to the idea of no kings was give me a break. Okay, how about no kings and aristocrats at least, because we could throw the billionaires in to the mix,
Right.
right? But this focus on no kings. Well, Paine in Common Sense indeed targeted monarchy. But if one reads Paine, not just Common Sense, but goes on from there, you can really see the degree to which he has a certain disdain for the rich. Okay, he has no intention of bringing an end to monarchy and bringing about the, if you like, independence of America and separation from monarchy, and leaving it at that. Okay, the trick is that he was fighting and he was arguing for not even simply a republic, though that's the term he used, but a democracy. And it just resonates throughout all of his writings. And later in Rights of Man, which is when he's now back in Europe because he's looking for money to build an iron bridge in America. But he's back there, and then the French Revolution erupts, and he writes a two-part pamphlet, essentially two books, in response to Edmund Burke's defense of
Mm.
the monarchy, both the French and especially the British monarchy. And he he says that well, he says a lot of things, but the point he makes is that if you could get rid of the monarch and the aristocrats, you could really begin, he doesn't use the term, but it's self-evident given what he describes could happen, social democracy. Get rid of this costly weight that we bear, and you could set up, education. You could provide for young families to be able to afford to have kids. You could provide social security for the elderly, et cetera, et cetera. No, when he wrote, he definitely had in mind that it isn't just the king that's the problem. It was the rich. And in fact, this is, if I can just say, he was when he was in England, he had a very people say a very checkered history of jobs. Okay, but over and over again, the problems he had could ultimately be traced to that monarchical and aristocratic order. So when he did come to America on Franklin's suggestion, they met in London in a pub or cafe, and they became friends. He basically came to America and fell in love with America because the king wasn't here, number one. Number two, the Americans had already essentially thrown out British authorities from towns and cities in the wake of the Boston Tea Party and then the imposition of what were called the coercive acts. So anyhow,
so he found his people, as they say now. He
definitely did. That's right.
And you were saying something I want to get back to, which is, I think you were saying, and again, talking about the No Kings demonstrations. I think this is germane. I think you were making the point that because a lot of American dissidents or separatists or whatever you want to call them at that point, that historical moment, still had this idealization of the king.
Yes.
I think you were basically saying, so he went straight for the king.
Yeah. And yes. In fact, just to prove your point, in January of 1776, which is the month in which Common Sense is published, Washington and his officers were still toasting the king at their dinners, which is to show you, which is to show you the attachment, you might say. And but Paine on January 9th or 10th, depending on which historian you believe, brings out this pamphlet, right? And that's it. He's at that point, all hell's going to break loose ultimately, and we're already in rebellion, but it's not yet a revolution. And that's the key.
And that to me, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up. I was critical of the resistance in many ways from the start. I mean, in the 21st Trump administration, I wrote a piece called Beyond Resistance. They did a conference about it. They didn't invite me to speak at it, but they did a conference about it. And the gist of it was, don't just talk about what you're against, talk about what you're for. But No Kings, as I say, I see the efficacy of it from a strictly communications perspective, but it seems to be, I've searched online, I've asked AIs, chatbots, different things, just to get a kind of sense of the public perception of what are these demonstrations about. One of the answers I got from an AI, I think it was a chatbot or something, was protests. Oh, here we go. The event aims to protest the policies and actions of the Donald Trump administration, including his purported fascist tendencies and associated democratic backsliding in the United States. Well, I certainly agree with that assessment of Donald Trump, but how did he get here? If you're only, if your idea is, well, we should better replace him with someone else who's funded by the same billionaire oligarchs, the next Donald Trump may be even worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
your thought, that's why I wanted to reach out to you, to reach out to through time to Donald, to Thomas Paine was,
how do we agonize. I assume you know about the Bulwark, this cluster of former neocons, who were basically, the folks around the Weekly Standard magazine that Murdoch had set up with Bill Kristol in command. Okay, so look, there's this it's like this not odd coalition, but liberals, and I mean liberals in the sense of the Democratic establishment types and their own journalistic cohort, and these neocons. They are the ones who limit the perspective pretty much to Trump. And there is no question of the threat that Trump and his cronies and cohorts and minions represent, given the levers of power that they now have. Okay. Yes, but it is imperative that Americans realize that this has been in the making and I argued this in a piece for Moyers, whew, back in 2017. This, this is, this has been developing since basically 1976. This is like 50 years of creeping authoritarianism that we've seen. And the Democrats were as much responsible for it as the Republicans were along the way. And to bring us back to Paine, I'll just point out, we were talking before about once upon a time, progressives did this and that. Ever since the Democrats turned their backs on the American working class and the FDR tradition, it was very hard to find Democrats who were supposedly the party of the people and had a good history of progressivism through the long age of Roosevelt, hardly ever made anything of Paine the radical, Paine the revolutionary, Paine who basically mobilizes Americans to the cause of democracy. Americans were already inclined to democracy. It's Paine who basically holds up a mirror and says, this is what you're doing and this is what you're capable of doing. And instead, of course, Paine was hijacked by Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election campaign, 79-80. He quotes Thomas Paine in his in his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention. And thereafter, if you look over the next decades, I'm not surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if you found more often conservatives were quoting Paine, not the Paine that I've talked about, not the Paine anti-aristocrat, not the Paine demanding more democracy, not the Paine who eventually goes on to propose Social Security, but the Paine who basically, who was the guy who said, pick up your guns and go fight the British. That's the kind of stuff you got out of in favor of no gun controls, that kind of thing.
Right.
So,
and that's a great point. And it hooks into a lot of all evolution of the word liberty and American culture, how it's come to mean different things. And it did, all that sort of thing. But also it's it's interesting you tie it to Reagan, because that may have been the start of the decades long process that's led to the Democrats being a party of the status quo since Donald Trump appeared.
Yeah, well, Jimmy Carter's responsible for that. But Carter, sure. But Reagan just grabbed hold of and basically he paved the way for Reagan to take over.
Right. And then with Donald Trump being, unpredictable, bold, and China shop, challenging established ideas, the Democrats doubled down on and continue to double down. Yeah. I did a video piece. I'm going to try to write it out on the fact that both Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris recently have defended great American companies and are quote unquote great titans of industry from that socialistic Trump guy. And, that's what they've become. So one of the reasons why also I'm leaning back to people like Thomas Paine is to quote George Clinton, not the colonial era governor of the state of New York, but George Clinton, the leader of Parliament Funkadelic, who said, free your mind, your ass will follow, which was basically later watered down by Beyonce and Destiny's Child into free your mind, the rest will follow.
Oh, yes, right.
But I really feel as if as long as people go, and they don't all, but if people go to a No Kings demonstration thinking, I'm doing something, if all they're doing is reinforcing the status quo that led to Donald Trump, it's an inoculation against real change. It's not a push towards real change.
Yeah.
I'm not knocking anybody, but do you get
No, I got you. I would love to know, because I would love to discover that among the speakers of these events, they say no kings and no aristocrats, and make it clear, or no economic royalists, as my friend Franklin Roosevelt put it. By the way, you used the term titans of industry. Did Harris and Newsom use that term?
Was it Harris or yes, Harris? I'm one of them said great. I have to go back to my notes of this piece I'm writing. One of them said titans of industry. One of them said great American companies. I
Okay.
can't remember which
The
was
reason I
which.
ask is, of course, that when FDR was running for president, he actually gave a speech very much in the spirit of Jefferson and even Paine. But the speech basically was a call. This is early on. This is 1932, before he became president, for an economic. He's called a Declaration of Economic Rights. And in there, he places it in a historical narrative. And the narrative is that for too long, we've allowed the titans of industry basically to crap all over the promise in the Declaration. I'm paraphrasing, but that's pretty much what he did in a long explanation. He didn't bring himself to say robber barons, but he makes it clear that when he says titans of industry, he means robber barons. He would not tolerate the persistence of the Gilded Age kind of corporate order. And if anyone, in fact, the other day I was reading a speech, not just Mamdani's speech, but I saw that one of the people who spoke before Mamdani, I wish I could remember who it was, actually referred to titans of industry basically as, in the form of FDR's reference of economic royalists. So I would love I would like to have trained a young cohort of people who are going to give talks of these things to say not only the royal, but also the economic royalists, something like that.
Well, yes, because this Democratic politician, I'm still looking now, I'm obsessed, was using it as a complimentary term.
Yeah, and that's what I understood from where you put it.
Yeah, and that is to me, then you're really promoting kings by a different name.
Yeah, that's the inside out version of when Obama, in his first inaugural address, basically said, "We are all responsible for this crisis." And
right. Speak for yourself, pal.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Right. Yeah. Americans, it's funny. One thought I had before I came on, which will be revealing of some of the things I escaped to. Romantic comedies that are available on television or on Netflix and all these places. So many of them are made up in Canada. And quite often there's a narrative that they use of a prince or a princess or a royal, basically, being stuck in some town or city, and people meeting this royal, not realizing who this person is. And then when they do discover it, these people who are supposed to be Americans, they bow. And there's nothing more to me subversive of the American democratic idea than to see Americans in any way bowing to monarchs. Just whew. So, and people have been fascinated by the royals in England.
Right. I feel the same way. I think they're dullards,
Yes,
boring
that's right.
people,
Yeah.
tiresome. If I were Princess Diana, I would want to get out of there at 90 miles an hour too. I
Yeah,
mean,
I understand. Yeah.
tragic what happened, but I mean, these are silly people, to quote Monty Python. They're very silly
Right.
people. And I will not tell you how I accidentally met the Queen in London,
Did you
but
really?
yes, I did.
Oh, no kidding. By the way, my mother-in-law would want to shake your hand. She's passed away some years ago, but whenever we were over in Britain and the news came on, if there was any story about the Queen, my mother-in-law would be informed by my father-in-law, and she would come running from wherever she was in the house into the lounge, as they call it, to see the Queen on TV. I mean, and I remember I would turn to Lauren and say, off with their heads, it's just that kind of stupid.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was during I think it was the 80s, there was a novel, popular novel that caused a bit of a fuss in England at the time about, and the premise of it was that a far left government had come to power in Great Britain and had deposed the Queen and her
Ah,
family,
uh-huh.
but allowed the Queen and former Queen and her husband to live in a council flat, in public subsidized housing
Yeah, right.
with lower income people, where they were known as Phil and Betty. And it was a funny premise,
It
but
was a funny premise, yeah.
and of course these people not knowing how to adjust to regular people and that, but people were upset. People were. You remember the Sex Pistols created quite
Yeah.
a stir with their "God Save the Queen" music. So, but my concern, and again, bringing it back to Paine and No King, is I think we have people used to talk about the Kennedys as American royalty, and that has been dispelled. But for many years, Americans had the same, and their media had the same fascination with the Kennedy family. But I think that was transferred for a while onto Bill and Hillary Clinton. Certainly for millions of people, I think it's still true of Barack and Michelle Obama.
Yes.
Fortunately, their kids seem to have avoided the spotlight, which speaks well of the parents,
Yeah.
actually. But the idea that we're waiting for our next charismatic leader who we can adore. Some people fixated that on what they thought Hillary Clinton would become, what they thought Kamala Harris would become, what they thought this one would become. The idea that we're still looking for that means to me we haven't truly understood the message of Thomas Paine yet.
Yeah, one of the things when Paine did write Common Sense, he knew there were certain ways he had to disabuse Americans of their affection for the king. And one thing about Paine is he was absolutely in favor. I mean, he really put it straight in Common Sense over and over again about the separation of church and state. He said, the only relationship between church and government, I think that's, something like that, religion and government, is that government should guarantee that everyone gets to practice it as they choose. Okay. Well, so here's the thing. So Paine had to disabuse Americans of any notion that the monarchy was somehow divinely ordained, right? And he does so by pointing out that even in the Bible, okay, the first big mistake the Jews made was that they disobeyed God and created a king for themselves, King Saul. So, and he really pushed that. And so when we saw recently in this past year, all those times where they would have those images on the internet of Trump being bowed to and in a saint and all those assholes, edit that out if you have to, touching him as if he was divinely ordained. And I thought, man, it's like they learned how to go back before Thomas Paine. Just it's amazing. Now, again, the fact is, though, if when we looked at the inauguration, we saw the deference of the economic royalists
Right.
to Trump, who showed up, to in essence to bow. They were going to be in the same room with his utterly vulgar and vile character. I mean, I don't even know how anyone would have shown up for that who had any decency, but they did, and here we are.
Well,
And
and that's a good theme maybe to weave into this, which another thing from the same interview with Kamala Harris, it was Rachel Maddow doing the interview. Uh, she Rachel introduced her by saying, Kamala Harris has become the queen of the "I told you so" crowd. She saw it all coming, and then immediately begins with something that Kamala Harris didn't see coming, and says in her book she didn't see coming, which is she said, "I didn't expect all the billionaire owners of the media companies to immediately cave in to Donald Trump." And then she goes on and, to say, "I thought our
yeah,
titans of industry would protect us," and so on. And I looked at that, I heard that, and I thought, you didn't? You must have been like the only one, because the fact is, Mark Zuckerberg, remember
yeah,
when
oh
the
yeah,
internet guys were supposed to be cool and they wore hoodies,
oh
Mark
yeah,
Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, all these people. Jeff Bezos now sounds like a 1952 Rotarian luncheon speaker talking about free market. You'd think yes, on one level, you'd think, well, they have enough money. They can tell the guy to go, F himself, but they want more. So if they got to kowtow to this, jackass, then they will. Okay. It's a game to them. And that to me is the essence of no kings means to me, and Thomas Paine speaks to me and says, no kings means not Trump, not the next Democratic candidate for president, not Larry Ellison, not any of
Yeah.
these bastards. They're just as idiotic and mediocre and sociopathically obsessed with self advancement as you think they are, and worse. And so go out, if you want a democracy, go out and get one and don't give a damn who tells you otherwise.
You know, it's interesting that if you think about it. I mean, I've really tried to figure out why they were so keen on lining up with him. Like there was like no reservations, you might say, no hesitation. And it is true that you can never have enough in their minds, right? You just can't have enough. But I also, but I still tried to figure out, was there any fear at work, not of Trump, but of their fellow citizens? And here's what I mean. Okay, so if we go back to the time of the Revolution, the likes of Jefferson and all the rest. Okay, that the idea of democracy, Jefferson's fantasies on occasion aside, the guy was a slaveholder. Let's be, we know that, but Adams and the rest, they didn't want democracy. That was very clear. They could have a republic, but if it was a republic, governed by an elite class, so to speak.
Right.
Okay, not aristocrats necessarily, but an elite. And so it was, I think his name was Elbridge Gerry, was from Massachusetts, one of the delegates to the Congress. And he actually said to his fellow delegates, there's the struggle's underway, and if we don't take charge of it, we'll be swept downriver by it.
Right.
So I tried to think about these guys, the ones we've been talking about, in quotes, titans of industry, the economic royalists. And I want to take us back to 2014, 15, 16. Okay. And I want to remind everyone listening that things were really percolating. I mean, it wasn't just Bernie was hot. Bernie, in essence, was in some ways was pushed forward by what was happening. You had, the anti-fracking, you had the $15, the labor was moving again. You had the Elizabeth Warren was out there with consumer protection and regulation. You had the Wisconsin Rising, you had Occupy. I mean, all these things have been percolating. And then, of course, Sanders enters the race. And in that sense, Sanders, in many ways, didn't come out of the blue. He sensed the times. And then the Democratic establishment did everything in their power to guarantee that the Queen would be crowned at the convention, Hillary Clinton.
Right.
And look, so these guys who are on their way to being multi-billionaires, they must have felt the heat from below, and they probably figured, hey, things could be different. God forbid, but they could be different. And to what extent they would respond to that. Anyhow, it's just
sure. And I mean, Barack Obama got more money from Wall Street the first time around than anyone in history. I don't know had up to that point. I don't know about his second race. Hillary Clinton got an enormous amount.
Yes, right.
And so the aristocrats are constantly trying to protect. I mean, I would write about 2010 about Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan Chase.
Oh, sure.
People when I was at writing for the Huffington Post. And back then I'd get these comments, to your point about these guys being afraid they would be swept away. People would comment, put in Jamie Dimon's address so we can go get him. And I would have to say, look, we don't do that. We're not that kind of people, right? No matter how negative an effect these people are having on the world, that's not how we resolve issues for any number of reasons, ethical and tactical as well, by the way. So, I mean, this anger has been there for a long time. And to me, if you're going to say no kings, you've already summarized it perfectly, Harvey. If you're going to say no kings, you have to say no aristocrats, no toadies. Yeah. I mean, I think they hated Parliament back in the 1300s, partially because it was mostly lords. Right? I mean, they had a House of Commons. I don't remember the House of Commons came into being. I guess Magna Carta, but
it is the case that even then the thing was set up so that if at best, basically the people who would elect anyone to the House of Commons was basically a property person who had
Right.
enough wealth to be entitled, because they had laws about property and taxes that enabled you to vote. Even, by the way, even in the time of Thomas Paine, it was only one of every 20 males, I believe, who could actually vote.
That's
Okay.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and you'd have you and by the way, the cities like Birmingham and others, they had limited little representation in parliament because you can imagine the lords who were, landed aristocrats, the last thing they want to do is hand over responsibility in parliament to any of these folks who might literally have emerged out of, even the artisan class. The artisans didn't even have enough to vote.
Right. And now here we are where it takes money in almost every case. There's some exceptions to run, you run for office. You
Yeah.
certainly can't influence public policy just because 70% of the public wants something. Doesn't
Right.
matter. So we don't have a functioning democracy now. And I guess that's the bottom line. I guess I would close with that is that, yes, Trump is doing horrific things and they need to be opposed, but we didn't have a functioning democracy before. He's
Right.
making it more brutal and violent and nakedly repressive, but we weren't free because Jimmy Kimmel could make fun of Donald Trump on late night TV. So
Just remember, every royal castle had the fool whose job it was to be like Jimmy Kimmel.
right, the insult comic, as they would say
Right.
now,
That's right. Yeah.
the Don Rickles.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right, of course.
In fact, even the idea of carnival was the one day a year that the world was allowed to be turned upside down in a symbolic way in the parades and theater. Otherwise, forget it.
Yeah, well, maybe we need. No, I'm not going to say we need that again. We just need an egalitarian society. So,
Well, if you look at Portland and elsewhere, when they get dressed up as animals in its own fashion, that's carnivalesque.
it's carnivalesque, and you can't tell, are they Hispanic? Do they look, quote unquote, like immigrants? Oh, who knows?
Right.
They're
Yeah.
just people wearing fun costumes. It is a great way to get the message out. You think these people are violent and causing a bloodbath? Which one? The one in the cat costume or the one in the kitty cat costume is, or the puppy? Which one is?
Right.
It's brilliant. It's smart. It's
Yeah. Right.
yeah.
Right.
So with all of that, Harvey J.K., as always, thanks for your insights. Again, his book relevant to this moment. They all are, but especially Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. So thanks for your insights, as I said, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for this tragic comic hour.
We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.